In the winter of 1847, on cabins scattered across the American frontier, dinner often came from things modern families would barely recognize as food. In places where markets were distant, harvests failed without warning, and snow could seal a household off for weeks. Survival depended on meals built from scraps, smoked cornmeal, lard, wild greens, and whatever could be stretched one more day. What makes that history so striking is not just the hardship, it is the intelligence hidden inside it. Many of the foods that kept frontier families alive were plain cheap and easy to dismiss. Some looked rough, some smelled strong, some were made from cuts, grains, and gathered plants that most people now ignore completely. But these were not random poor man's meals. They were practical systems. Every pot, every crust, every preserved jar carried knowledge about weather distance, hunger storage, and time. And the real paradox is this: foods once associated with desperation are now studied as examples of thrift, resilience, and even nutritional common sense. In this countdown, we will uncover the lost breads, broths, scrap meals, and fireside staples that fed isolated families through lean seasons and long winters. Some came from necessity, some from memory, and some were so effective that entire communities trusted them with their lives. This was not elegant cooking. This was frontier survival. Before we reach the end of this list, you will see why a skillet cake made from almost nothing could stand in for bread, why salted meat scraps were treated like treasure, and how a kettle of thin broth could still carry a family through another bitter night. You will also meet foods made from wild plants, rough ground meal, rendered fat, and parts of animals that modern kitchens usually throw away without a second thought. Some of these dishes sound severe, some sound strangely inventive, and a few have quietly returned in modern food culture under new names, higher prices, and far more romance than they ever had on the frontier. Because that is the story hidden inside these meals. What once meant hardship can later become heritage. What once looked like poverty can turn out to be skill. If you enjoy stories about forgotten food, survival history, and the meals that built everyday life, take a moment to subscribe. There is a whole world of old knowledge buried in these kitchens. Now let's begin with the foods that sat closest to the fire, stretched the farthest, and kept families going when there was almost nothing left. Number 25. Ash cakes. One of the simplest frontier survival foods was the ash cake, a rough bread made from basic cornmeal dough and baked in the heat of a hearth. Sometimes it was wrapped in leaves, sometimes it was placed on a flat stone, sometimes it was buried close to hot embers and ash where the outside scorched while the inside slowly firmed into something dense and filling. It was not refined bread. It was not meant to be. Ash cake existed because flour was scarce, ovens were unreliable, and people still needed something hot in their stomachs before a day of labor. The texture could be coarse, almost gritty, with a smoky crust and a heavy center that demanded slow chewing. But that heaviness was the point. It filled the body. It stayed with you. Today people romanticize hearth baking. On the frontier, this was bread stripped down to survival. Number 24. Salt pork and gravy. Salt pork was less a luxury than a lifeline. Frontier families relied on heavily salted cuts of pork because they kept longer than fresh meat and could flavor an entire meal with only a small amount. A scrap of it sizzling in a pan released fat smoke and salt into the room, turning plain food into something deeply satisfying. Often the drippings became gravy. Flour or meal was stirred in. Water or milk, if available, stretched it further. Then the whole thing was poured over bread biscuits or boiled potatoes. This was the genius of the frontier table. A little meat did not feed one person. It flavored food for many. The taste was rich, salty, and almost overwhelming after days of bland meals. But in hard weather, richness mattered. It meant energy. It meant warmth. It meant one preserved ingredient could carry a family farther than fresh meat ever could. What modern diners might call too salty, frontier households called security. Number 23. Bean pot stew. Few foods worked harder than beans. Dried beans stored traveled well and expanded into a substantial meal with little more than water time and patience. On the frontier, a bean pot could hang near the fire for hours, slowly softening into a thick stew that smelled earthy, warm, and dependable. Sometimes the pot included onion, salt pork, or a bone saved from an earlier meal. Sometimes it did not. Either way, beans offered one of the cheapest and most reliable sources of nourishment available to working families far from town. Their texture was soft but hearty, and the broth around them often carried a deep smoky flavor if any fat had been added. Even when the pot looked plain, it delivered what mattered most: fullness. Modern convenience foods promise efficiency. Frontier beans delivered it for real. Number 22. Johnnycakes. Johnnycakes were another cornmeal staple that traveled across early American life, especially where wheat was expensive or unavailable. Depending on the household, they might be pan-fried, griddled, or baked, creating a bread that was thin, crisp at the edges and sturdy enough to eat by hand. For frontier families, Johnny Cakes solved multiple problems at once. They required few ingredients, they cooked quickly, and they worked beside almost anything: beans, molasses, gravy, drippings, or broth. That made them more than a side dish. They were edible infrastructure. The smell of corn browning and hot fat could make a sparse meal feel far larger than it was. Their taste was slightly sweet, slightly smoky, and deeply satisfying when eaten hot by the fire. And unlike softer loaves, they held up well in rough conditions. Today, artisanal corn cakes may appear on restaurant menus. Back then, they were what stood between hunger and the next day's work. Number 21. Pot liquor with greens. When families cooked hearty greens like collards, turnips, beet tops, or wild leaves, the liquid left behind was rarely thrown away. That broth, often called pot liquor, held salt, plant minerals, bits of fat, and the deep flavor drawn out during cooking. People drank it from a cup, sopped it with bread, or used it to enrich another meal. Nothing was wasted. This was especially important in places where gardens where small meat was limited and every source of nourishment mattered. Greens themselves helped break the monotony of starch-heavy meals, but the broth turned even a humble pot of leaves into something larger and more sustaining. The flavor could be vegetal, smoky, and slightly bitter in a way modern eaters sometimes forget how to appreciate. But to people living close to scarcity, that cup of hot liquid meant warmth, salt, and strength. It was not just leftovers. It was survival still steaming. Number 20. Corn dodger. The corn dodger was dense, practical, and built for hard use. Usually made from cornmeal, water, salt, and sometimes fat, it was shaped by hand into small oblong cakes and baked or fried until firm. It did not try to be soft. It tried to last. On the frontier, that mattered. A family might need food that could be carried to the field, eaten without utensils, or made quickly from shelf-stable ingredients. Corn dodgers answered all of those needs. Their texture was often compact and crumbly, sometimes dry unless eaten with gravy or stew. But that dryness also made them durable. They traveled in pocket sacks and work baskets. They could sit beside a laborer all day and still be edible by dusk. In modern terms, people might call them too plain. But plain food that kept its shape, resisted spoilage, and filled the stomach had enormous value when daily life was physically punishing. This was not bread made to impress. It was bread made to endure. Number 19. Milk toast. Milk toast sounds delicate now, but on the frontier, it could be practical comfort food for children, elders, the sick, or anyone worn down by labor and cold. Stale bread was softened in hot milk sometimes with a little butter, a pinch of salt, or a faint touch of sweetening if the household had any to spare. It was a meal built on softness and salvage. Rather than throw out old bread, families transformed it into something warm, easy to swallow, and emotionally reassuring. The smell was gentle. The texture was tender and almost pudding-like. In a life full of rough fabrics, rough weather, and rough meals, that softness mattered. And yet even here, survival logic was at work. Bread was extended. Milk was made more filling. Waste was turned into comfort. What sounds old-fashioned now once served as quiet frontier medicine. Number 18. Fried mush. Fried mush began as cooked cornmeal porridge left to cool and set. Once firm, it could be sliced and fried in a pan until the outside turned golden and crisp while the inside stayed soft and steaming. This allowed one meal to become another with no waste and almost no added cost. That kind of transformation was frontier intelligence at its best. The outside crackled. The inside stayed smooth and mild. Eaten with molasses, gravy, or drippings, fried mush could move between breakfast, supper, and emergency filler without complaint. It also reveals something modern kitchens often forget: survival food was rarely about a single recipe. It was about flexibility. One pot today became tomorrow's slices. Yesterday's necessity became today's hot meal. That was the frontier way. Stretch it, reheat it, survive on it. Before we go further, it is worth pausing on one important truth. Frontier food was never just about ingredients. It was about memory, repetition, and knowledge carried by hand. In many homes, the people who kept families fed were not working from written recipes. They were working from habit, observation, and inherited instinct. They knew how long beans could stretch, which greens could be gathered safely, how much fat to save when bread dough was too wet for one use but perfect for another. This knowledge often lived in mothers, grandmothers, widows, and daughters who learned by watching, not by reading. That is one reason so many of these foods disappeared so easily. They were rarely recorded with pride. They belonged to ordinary kitchens, smoky rooms, iron pots, and tired hands. But those meals held an entire survival system inside them. Not elegant, not fashionable, just essential. And for thousands of frontier families, that was more than enough. Number 17. Squirrel stew. On much of the frontier, wild game was not a sporting luxury. It was dinner. And squirrel, small as it was, appeared often in survival cooking because it was common, accessible, and worth the effort when larger game was scarce. A few squirrels in a pot with water onion if available, and perhaps a handful of herbs or roots could become a stew that fed more people than the meat alone ever could. The meat was lean, slightly dark, and deeply savory when simmered long enough to soften. What mattered most, though, was not abundance. It was extension. A small catch could be stretched with broth, vegetables, and thyme. Modern people often imagine survival in terms of dramatic hunting. Frontier reality was more modest. It was small animals, small returns, small victories. And sometimes that was enough to keep hunger back one more night. Number 16. Crackling bread. After fat was rendered from pork, the browned bits left behind cracklings were too valuable to waste. Mixed into cornmeal batter and baked into bread, they turned a plain staple into something richer, saltier, and more satisfying. The bread carried the smell of smoke and pork with little bursts of crispness in each bite. For frontier families, this was economy at its sharpest. The hog provided meat, fat drippings, and then even its leftovers improved the bread. Nothing stopped at its first use. Crackling bread also reveals an old truth about hardship food. It was rarely flavorless. In fact, some of these meals survived precisely because they gave comfort as well as calories. The savory edge from those tiny scraps could make a rough supper feel almost generous. Now, foods like this may be treated as regional heritage. Back then, it was simply too practical not to make. Number 15. Foraged onion and wild herb broth. When supplies ran thin, the landscape itself became part of the pantry. Wild onions, garlic sorrel, chickweed nettles, and other edible plants could be gathered and turned into broths or simple cooked dishes that added flavor and nutrients to an otherwise bleak table. These were not decorative herbs. They were emergency support. The broth made from them could be sharp, green, earthy, and surprisingly alive after days of eating starches and preserved foods. Even a few leaves or bulbs changed the entire feeling of a meal. They brought freshness where there was none. But this kind of food demanded knowledge. Frontier families had to know what was safe, what was seasonal, and what could be trusted in the woods or fields around them. That is why these meals belonged not just to hunger, but to memory and inherited skill. A modern grocery store replaces uncertainty with packaging. The frontier replaced packaging with knowledge. Number 14. Lye hominy. Hominy was corn transformed through labor and technique. Dried corn kernels were treated, cleaned, and cooked until they swelled into something softer, fuller, and more digestible. On the frontier, hominy could be boiled into a side dish, fried later, or used as a filling base in meals that needed to last. Its flavor was gentle but distinctive, with a deep corn character and a texture that sat somewhere between chewy and tender. More importantly, it stored well in dry form and became substantial once prepared. This was not convenience food. It was process food in the oldest sense, food improved by knowledge. Families knew how to take a humble grain and make it more useful, more nourishing, and more versatile. Today, industrial food systems promise innovation. Frontier kitchens had their own kind of innovation long before packaging and marketing ever existed. Number 13. Fatback with beans or greens. Fatback was not glamorous. It was salt, fat, preservation, and power. Kept as a cured slab, it could be sliced sparingly and used to season beans, greens, cabbage, or any pot that needed more body. The amount might be small. The effect was not. The smell alone could change the room. Once the fat hit heat, everything felt more alive. A pot that had seemed meager became fragrant, savory, and worth gathering around. This mattered on the frontier, where morale lived close to the stove. Fatback also shows how survival cooking relied on concentration. You did not always need large quantities. You needed ingredients that delivered more than their size suggested. Salt preserved. Fat satisfied. Flavor encouraged people to eat what they had. Modern eating often treats fat as excess. On the frontier, fat was insurance. Number 12. Hoe cakes. Hoe cakes were another cornmeal bread, but they carried the unmistakable mark of work and improvisation. Their name recalls a world where cooking tools were simple, surfaces were rough, and food had to adapt to the realities of labor. Mixed from cornmeal and water, sometimes with salt or fat, these cakes could be cooked on hot metal and eaten quickly, often with little else. They were crisp at the edge, soft in the middle, and humble in every visible way. Yet they solved a central frontier problem: how to produce hot, edible bread fast with few ingredients and fewer utensils. That made them perfect for moving households, field labor, and kitchens where time and fuel both mattered. In today's language, they were efficient. In the frontier's language, they were necessary. Simple enough to overlook, essential enough to survive. Number 11. Bone broth soup. When meat was scarce, bones kept working. A marrow bone, a joint bone, or the remains of a roast could be simmered for hours, drawing out flavor, richness, and substance into a broth that felt stronger than its ingredients looked. Potatoes, onions, grains, or scraps of greens might join the pot, but even without them, the broth itself had value. It warmed cold hands. It softened hard bread. It made the room smell like supper. And in frontier life, smell mattered. The promise of food mattered. A thin but fragrant pot could steady a family emotionally as well as physically. It marked one more day, survived with care and resourcefulness. Modern cooks may rediscover bone broth as wellness culture. Frontier families never needed to rename it. They already knew what a long-simmered pot could do. Number 10. Dried apple and bread pudding. Not every survival food was savory. When apples were available in season, many families dried them for colder months, preserving one of the few fruits that could last. Later, those apples could be softened with water and cooked into a humble pudding with stale bread, a little fat, and perhaps molasses or spice, if fortune allowed. The result was soft, fragrant, and deeply comforting. It carried sweetness, but also thrift. Bread was reused, fruit was preserved. A simple dessert became a way to break the emotional weight of hard living. This mattered more than it may seem. Survival is not only physical. A spoonful of something warm and faintly sweet could restore a sense of normal life around the table, especially for children. Even on the frontier, comfort had nutritional value of its own. Number 9. Slump or cobbler from stored fruit. A frontier cobbler was rarely the lavish dessert modern diners picture. It was often a practical way to use dried, stored, or heavily cooked fruit beneath a rough topping of dough. It baked into something soft underneath, crusted on top, and fragrant enough to transform an ordinary evening. It also showed how families stretched preserved food beyond bare necessity. They did not live on calories alone. They used whatever they had to create moments of reward, memory, and continuity. That may be the greatest surprise in all of this. Even in hardship, people still made room for something that felt like home. There is another reason these foods deserve a second look. Modern science and food historians increasingly recognize that many old survival meals were more rational than they first appear. A pot of beans paired with fat or corn delivered lasting energy. Long-simmered broth extracted value from bones modern households often discard. Wild greens added minerals and variety to diets that might otherwise collapse into starch and salt. Even preserved foods, when used carefully, gave frontier families something modern convenience culture still depends on: stability. The difference is that old kitchens understood exactly why stability mattered. These meals were not designed for trend branding or novelty. They were designed to keep people working warm and alive through uncertainty. And in a strange irony, some of the same food logic now returns under the language of sustainability, nose-to-tail eating, ancestral nutrition, and seasonal cooking. The frontier never called it any of that. It simply called it supper. And sometimes, supper was the thin line between endurance and collapse. Number 8. Pone bread. Pone bread was one of those frontier foods that asked very little and gave a great deal back. Usually made from coarse cornmeal, water, salt, and sometimes a bit of fat, it was shaped into a compact loaf or cake and baked until the outside formed a firm crust. It was sturdy, plain, and dependable. That dependability is exactly why it mattered. On the frontier, families needed bread that could be made without fine flour, expensive ingredients, or delicate handling. Pone answered that need. It paired with beans, greens, stews, and drippings. It could sit on a rough table beside nearly any meal and still do its job. The flavor was deep and corny, the texture dense, sometimes dry, but always filling. Today, soft bread is often treated as the standard of quality. On the frontier, the better bread was the bread that lasted, traveled, and filled the stomach after hard work. Pone bread was not built for pleasure first. It was built for survival. Number 7. Molasses bread or molasses-sweetened mush. Sugar was not always easy to get, but molasses often made its way into frontier kitchens because it stored well-added flavor and could turn a plain meal into something more sustaining. Mixed into bread, stirred into mush, or drizzled over cornmeal dishes, it brought darkness, sweetness, and a trace of comfort to otherwise spare food. That mattered in ways modern abundance can make hard to see. A little sweetness could lift morale. It could help children eat coarse food more willingly. It could make the difference between a meal that felt punishing and one that felt human. The taste was rich, smoky, and deep, with a bitterness under the sweetness that somehow suited frontier life perfectly. Nothing here was extravagant. Even comfort arrived in measured amounts. But measured comfort is still comfort. And sometimes that was enough to steady a household through another week of cold work and uncertainty. Number 6. Scrapple or panscrap loaf. Long before nose-to-tail eating became fashionable language, frontier households already understood the principle completely. When butchering season came, scraps mattered. Bits of meat, broth, meal organs, and trimmings could be cooked down, thickened, cooled, sliced, and fried into a loaf-like food that used what otherwise might have been lost. This kind of dish, whether called scrapple or something similar by local custom, turned leftovers into structure. It created a food that could be stored, briefly cut cleanly, and fried when needed. The outside crisped in the pan. The inside stayed soft, savory, and rich with everything the household had managed to save. To modern eyes, such foods can look severe, but the logic behind them is hard to argue with. Waste less, eat more, respect the animal fully. In an age of plastic packaging frontier, people made thrift taste like breakfast. Number 5. Hand pie or fried apple turnover from leftover dough. A small hand pie made from leftover dough and preserved filling may seem too modest to belong in a story about survival, but that is exactly why it belongs here. Survival did not happen only through the heavy main dishes. It also happened through skillful reuse, careful storage, and the ability to turn remnants into something portable and sustaining. Frontier cooks might use dried apples, mashed pumpkin, or whatever thick filling the season allowed, fold it into scraps of dough and bake, or fry it into a food that traveled well and wasted nothing. It was practical, yes, but it was also personal. These were the kinds of foods children remembered. The crust might be rough, the filling sparse, the sweetness faint. Yet carried in a pocket or wrapped in cloth, a hand pie could feel like more than food. It could feel like care, prepared in advance. It could feel like home, sent out into the world with you. And that too is part of survival history. Not just calories, but reassurance. Number 4. Salt rising bread. Salt rising bread stands out because it speaks to frontier ingenuity at a deeper level. In places and times where commercial yeast was unavailable or unreliable, families still found ways to make bread rise through older fermentation methods. The result was a loaf unlike most modern bread, close-textured, strong-smelling, slightly cheesy in aroma, but wonderfully tender when done well. It was not the kind of bread everyone would understand today. In fact, many people might find the smell surprising. But on the frontier, what mattered was not convention. It was whether a loaf could be made with what was on hand. Salt-rising bread proves that these kitchens were not primitive in the lazy way modern people sometimes imagine. They were experimental, adaptive, technically clever. They worked with living processes long before food science had modern branding. A frontier loaf did not need to be fashionable. It needed to rise despite the odds. Number 3. Mush and milk. Sometimes survival food was not dramatic at all. Sometimes it was mush and milk. A bowl of cooked cornmeal thinned or enriched with milk eaten hot was one of the quiet meals that appeared again and again in older rural and frontier life. It was cheap, soft, fast enough, and capable of feeding children, workers, and elders alike. Its simplicity is exactly what gave it power. The bowl steamed. The spoon moved slowly. The taste was mild creamy if the milk was generous, thinner if it was not. But either way, it offered warmth and a sense of steadiness. Not every meal had to be memorable to be important. Some only had to appear reliably when the family needed them. Modern culture often celebrates bold flavors and novelty. Frontier life depended on foods that were repeatable, adaptable, and mercifully familiar. Mush and milk was not exciting. It was dependable. That can matter more than excitement ever will. Number 2. Chicken and dumplings made to stretch one bird. When a frontier family had a chicken, that bird was too valuable to be spent carelessly. It might flavor broth, first feed the main pot next, and then be extended with dumplings made from simple dough so the meal reached more people than the meat alone ever could. This is one of the clearest examples of frontier abundance created out of limitation. The broth carried richness. The dumplings added body. The small pieces of meat scattered through the pot made the whole thing feel generous even when the actual amount of chicken was modest. Steam rising from that kettle meant nourishment, but it also meant strategy. Stretch the expensive part. Build around it. Make one bird feed many. Today, chicken and dumplings may be remembered as comfort food. On the frontier, comfort was only one layer of the story. Beneath it sat arithmetic, patience, and survival. And that is what makes the dish unforgettable. Number 1. Cornbread and buttermilk. At the center of frontier survival stood one of the simplest pairings of all, cornbread and buttermilk. It was humble enough to disappear from history books, but powerful enough to anchor daily life for countless families. Cornbread used the grain that many households could actually afford or produce. Buttermilk, often left after buttermaking, gave drink moisture, tang, and nourishment without waste. Together they formed more than a meal. They formed a system. The cornbread was crumbly, warm, and sturdy. The buttermilk was cool, sharp, and alive with the flavor of real dairying. Eaten together, they balanced one another, perfectly dry and moist, dense, and light, plain, and vivid. It was a combination built not by chefs, but by necessity, refined over time. And that is why it deserves the top place. Because this was the frontier in edible form. Resourceful, repetitive, unpretentious, effective. These families did not survive because they had endless options. They survived because they knew how to make enough from what they had. They knew how to preserve, stretch, gather, render, simmer, reuse, and endure. Their meals were often plain, sometimes harsh, occasionally comforting, and almost always intelligent. What modern life forgot was not just the taste of these foods, it was the thinking behind them. The old frontier table was not filled with luxury. It was filled with judgment, memory, and hard-earned skill. In every pot of beans, every corn cake, every broth made from scraps, there was a quiet message passed from one generation to the next. Nothing was wasted. Everything mattered. And that is what kept them alive.